Hi, I'm James McGuire, editor of Datamation, and our topic today is the software-defined data center. To talk about that, we've got four industry experts. With us is Dana Gardner, founder, analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions. Dana, how are you today?
I'm great. It's good to be with you, Jim.
Good. And Dana, tell me, what sort of clients do you typically consult with in your consulting work?
Yeah, I work with software infrastructure implementations, both on the buy and sell side. So typically, it's what supports applications in the enterprise.
Okay. Also with us is Yoram Novik, CEO and founder of Maxta, a software-defined vendor. Hello to you, Yoram.
How are you? It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and tell me, how long has Maxta been around? I think it's a fairly new outfit, is it not?
Well, Maxta has been around since 2009, but we went out of stealth mode in November of last year, so we've been around for about 9 months now.
Gotcha. Okay, I'm gonna call that an official startup. Also with us is Greg Schulz, analyst, IT expert, founder of the consultancy Storage.io. Hello to you, Greg.
Hey, James. How are you?
Good, good. And you are. What sort of folks do you consult with in your consulting business?
Yeah, so I'm focused on data infrastructure, topics, themes, trends, which would be both hardware, software, virtual, cloud, converged, hardware, software on both the buy, the sell side. So in other words, to the actual customer, to the vendors, but also to the financial community.
Okay, great.
So kind of in the middle.
That's a lot going on. Also with us, Alessandro Barbieri, product manager at Pluribus Networks, a software-defined vendor. Hello to you, Alessandro.
Hello to you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and you mentioned you were there in Palo Alto. You were an official Silicon Valley software vendor.
Yeah, and here sitting on the east side of Palo Alto, though.
And we see behind you the photo of the guy who invented the Ethernet. You like the patron saint of the Ethernet is even behind you. You are well accompanied.
We have Leonardo da Vinci and Bob Metcalfe in our conference.
Think of them as equal experts, you know.
Without this guy, there's no Pluribus, there's no cloud, there's no software-defined data center.
Interesting. Yeah. Speaking of which, the software-defined data center, or SDDC, as it's known in its acronym, I think it's one of those ideas that is as much vision as it is reality. I wonder if there is fully a data center out there that is completely software-defined at this point. If there is, I want to know about it. But just to start off, I guess I'd like to ask the four of you, why deploy software-defined data center? Why should a company move towards it? Or take your pick on the question. What is it? Why is it important? Or really, what is it? Yoram, why don't you start off? Why should companies even care about thinking about SDDC?
Well, it's a very good question. So if you look at the relatively short industry of computing, as it is for the last 50 years, there was always this separation of having the data center built out of three components: computer server on one side, storage on the other side, and networking as a third element. Mm-hmm. And they were mostly what we can call today hardware defined, in the sense that each one evolved independently by developing better, faster, more efficient boxes. I think the idea of software defined started actually on the server side with server virtualization, which you can call software defined servers.
Right.
And this actually enabled a new way to run your infrastructure rather than on physical boxes, on more logical entities. So the idea of a virtual machine is you don't need a physical hardware to run your application. You can run it on a virtual machine the same way you can run it on hardware, and that really enables you new level of automation, simplicity, and efficiency. And I think what software-defined storage is really taking this concept to the two other entities, network and storage, and making it all combined together to give you a much more efficient, much more scalable data center. Maxta pitch is basically working on the storage side to provide software-defined storage.
Daniel, what's your sense? I mean, why should companies even start to think about SDDC? Why should it matter to them?
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with everything Yoram said. I think that what happens when you move into software defined, both at the level of a specific part of the stack, like networking or storage or server, you get some pretty impressive tactical benefits. Generally, you have higher utilization, you have more control over the life cycle of the element, the resource, and you can increase automation around that, all of which are really important. But then there's a strategic benefit. When you've gone to that higher abstraction of software defined, when you're no longer tied directly to the hardware through virtualization and other techniques, you get a strategic benefit of now being able to move an entire workload that includes the storage, the network, and the server. And this starts to get at what has really been the nirvana or holy grail of operations. They want to be able to choose where and how they spin up not just resources that contribute to the support of a workload, but actually the entire workload. And this is where we'll perhaps get to that promise of hybrid cloud and being able to move in complete, full working order a workload from dev to test to operations. So there's a strategic benefit here when you go software defined, as well as tactical benefits about utilization, lower cost, and automation within them.
You know, as you were speaking, I thought of, I imagine myself as a typical IT manager, and I heard you talking about the value of the abstraction, and it's somewhere in there it sounds like, gosh, this has gotten significantly more complicated than the old, quote-unquote, old-fashioned hardware system. It sounds like you're going to need personnel that is more skilled, and maybe there's more that can go wrong in terms of the software itself. I know we're a slight tangent, but what's your sense of that, Dana?
I don't know if that's the case. You know, what's harder is when you have to integrate all of these elements because they stand alone, they're from different platform eras or different vendors or different standards approaches, so that the integration every step of the way is already complex and then gets sometimes exponentially more complex when you try to modernize or be agile with changing your underlying assets. So to go software defined might be a hurdle organizationally, culturally, skills, but I think it frees you up from the hassles of enterprise integration that we've been suffering for 20 years.
Alessandro, agree, disagree? I mean, why should a company move into this, and why is it important?
Yeah, no, first of all, I mean, trying to add to what Dana and Yoram already said is definitely, I completely agree, but I think you asked at the beginning, why now? Again, I actually live and trying to make products out of networking, but what I'm seeing is a trend that now is a perfect moment, or there's sort of a perfect storm brewing, because the hardware is getting to a point where we have commoditization spreading fast across all layers of the stack. I can say the guy here invented Ethernet, but look at, we have the storage gentleman here. Fiber channel is moving over Ethernet, or fiber channel is moving to direct attached storage. So the massive disruption in the storage, the way storage is consumed. The same is true in networking, right? The traditional monolithic, vertically integrated vendors are disappearing. Now you have to look at what Facebook has done to unlock the entire ecosystem. We have started, but we are seeing now the seeds for 3-5 years down the line, a completely different way of consuming the network as well. And then, of course, compute started the revolution 10 years ago. But the point here is that there's a confluence of trends in the industry at the platform level, which now are unlocking the possibility of deploying software on a uniform and diverse sort of Lego block type of infrastructure, where customers are free to pick and choose commodities out of any hardware shop or manufacturer in Taiwan. So this is a fundamental trend of why now, because now fundamentally we have the platforms on top of which this software can reside on. The other thing is, I would just want to make a comment that the customer we're talking to, again, we have a small company, so we're talking to the customer interested in virtualization technology, and those are the cloud providers, some enterprises. Everybody's looking for ways to, in the end, to hit their bottom line, and in the end, have operational savings and capex savings. So SDDC makes sense if and only if it provides this ultimate benefit of dramatically reducing cost. And personally, maybe I'm going to be a little bit more challenging or throw some polemic here in the discussion.
Polemic? We're always fond of polemic.
Yeah, no, not every technology probably is going to really save you money to build SDDC. So OpenStack is probably going in that direction. I'm not sure alternatives are going in the same direction. It would be interesting to hear what the other people think on the economics of moving to SDDC.
Greg, what's your sense? I mean, what is this thing called software-defined data center? And I think it's interesting, Alessandro's comment about the commoditization of hardware. I mean, this is a heartbreak of hardware vendors. It seems like that's certainly one of the things driving this. But why now, and what is it?
Well, I mean, there's several different themes here, and everything said so far, yeah, it's spot on from an industry standpoint. It's that's the industry narrative. But then there's the other narrative, the other conversation, which is customer focused. But here, let's keep this in mind for a minute. You can't have hardware without software. You can't have software without hardware. And the whole key is, how can you define the hardware? How can you define the software, the hard products, hardware, software? How can you define those to derive more business value? Whether that's cost cutting, whether that's taking out OpEx. A lot of people focused on CapEx, but they really need to start focusing on the OpEx. But what it really gets down to is that for some, this whole software-defined era is new and revolutionary. For others, it's a huge deja vu if you peel back the industry rhetoric, the industry narrative about leveraging new, because both hardware and software have become commoditized. How are you going to define those to map them to an environment? To the customer, you mentioned, when I talk with the customers, you mentioned software defined. Outside of those who are on the bandwagon, have their new favorite company, generally, if they're polite, they'll kind of look at you funny. Otherwise, their eyes roll. Because, on the other hand, if I say, well, what do you think about software-defined networking management, software-defined data center management, software-defined storage management, they lean forward and they're like, well, what do you mean? What aspect of management? What does that encompass? And that all of a sudden starts to open up the dialogue, because we've had software-defined networking for decades. We've had software-defined storage for decades. We've had software-defined servers, virtualization for decades, but they've been proprietary approaches or using proprietary type technologies. The key right now, and this is what I think the big breakthrough has to become, is to articulate, instead of the industry, us talking to each other, articulate out to the bigger population of people is this value prop of software-defined is more than software-defined marketing, that it's really about the management, unlocking the value of the hardware, unlocking the value of the software, unlocking the value of the cloud, removing barriers as opposed to creating new barriers.
Well, let's talk about the idea of cost, because I think, no matter how beneficial it is or is not, it's always going to come down to the bottom line. Dana, do you think this is SDDC is a way to cut costs, or is it a better tool that should cost more because it gives you more? I mean, are we moving to a Toyota to save money, or are we moving to a Rolls-Royce and we get a much better ride across town?
Well, I would start by saying that we ought to be saving money no matter what. But I also don't want to confuse software-defined with open source and with cloud. They're different. They're distinct. And they all seem to be happening at once. And so there is a very complicated tangle of overlapping trends and imperatives for enterprises and service providers as well. But unpacking that a little bit, the costs are going to go down for two big reasons. One, the technology, and then secondly, the marketplace. When you move to OpEx, as we've discussed, you're opening up yourself to be compared apples to apples, orange to oranges to other service providers. And you can start to make rational decisions about what types of workloads you want to retain on premises, perhaps keeping them on their legacy platforms. If it doesn't make sense to rip it off, you don't. But you're able to start saying, well, maybe there's some commodity or context rather than core applications and data sets that I could start to think about moving elsewhere. Maybe that's a cloud model. Maybe it's just colo or managed service provider of some sort, or hosting approach that you share economically. But if you go to OpEx, you can start to say whether that makes sense or not. And in that marketplace, all those other different types of hosting organizations are going to vie for your business. And we've got some very big, powerful organizations like Google and Amazon that incidentally have business models supported by other types of economic profit and loss centers. So I think that the economics are shifting just as much as the technology. I do think the technology will allow for less facilities and square footage. You're getting more bang out of your buck in terms of that commodity hardware. You're going to use less energy because of that commodity hardware. You're going to go to an OpEx, and so you can charge back across your organization, and you have a better real sense of what your IT costs are, and you can charge people appropriately. Rather than surprise your CIO at the end of the quarter or your CFO at the end of the year. So all of those things technically are going to create lower costs, but it's the marketplace where the demand for commodity level resources for more and more apps and more data types are going to provide a often downward pressure on price and therefore a better overall cost for the end user.
Yoram, it sounds like Dana is saying that there is a possibility of cost savings with SDDC. Do you see it as that, or see it as just a better tool that should cost more?
Well, I think the main benefit of software-defined data center are simplicity, scalability, and the ability to use the latest, greatest hardware technology. So if you think about the old model of having hardware-defined data center, then you have to use different components that didn't scale at the same level and were not simple to manage. So simplicity, having automation, is one large benefit. The second benefit is the ability to use latest and greatest technology, and you don't have to make the increment based on the specific hardware that you're using. So I think those are the main reasons to go to software-defined. They also definitely reduce the OpEx. Because if you think about cost, the OpEx side is the majority, and by simplifying and automating, you definitely get the cost reduction. I'm not sure about the CapEx, because again, CapEx is a little bit different, and how do you charge for it? I think the opportunity for software-defined is to change the model from, say, a perpetual model, which is the old model for selling into the data center, to more of a subscription model. So I think cost saving, especially on the OpEx side and maybe long-term on the CapEx side, will be there, but the main benefits are not just the cost. It's not all about cost cutting. It's about simplification, it's about scalability, and then the cost will come down the road. But when an organization thinks long-term, definitely they should value the cost saving, especially at the OpEx side.
Alessandro, speaking from a vendor perspective, when someone comes to you and says, well, is this going to save us money? Do you say yes, or do you say, well, maybe, but it's really going to actually offer you more for the same amount of money, or maybe more money?
No, I mean, the bottom line is that you have to save money. Whether you're taking money out of OpEx or capital expenditure, it doesn't matter, but you need to show net savings on the bottom line. Otherwise, everything we do doesn't make sense. They might as well extend the status quo. So you have to save in some dimension, right? So what we're finding out, and again, it's just a partial and limited view because we are a small company, is that a lot of our customers are telling us that the proprietary lockings of certain solutions offset some of the operational savings in agility and flexibility that they might get. So there's a huge tax that particularly the incumbents in the industry are placing on anything virtualized. And also there is a challenge that right now we have virtualization very much in silos. You have the virtual network, you have the virtual storage, you have the different cloud management and virtualization management stacks. But they don't. If you want to virtualize compute, then you need to look for a different solution to virtualize the network or to virtualize storage. They don't necessarily. You don't necessarily have a unified, let's say, orchestration system that touches all the components, which adds a lot of complexity. So not only you have to deal with the proprietary lockings, but also with the diversity of virtualization system that you have to teach. Not to mention that I was reading a statistics from Cisco, again, maybe biased, maybe not, but they claim that 60% of the workloads in a data center are still bare metal. So you also have to deal, any virtualization solution has to accommodate the transition or even the permanent existence of bare metal workloads. So there's a tremendous complexity in orchestrating a transition to cloud, and the challenge of proprietary lock-ins is very questionable at this point with technologies we have at the level of maturity that there are real savings. So customers are struggling and are trying to understand the business model for moving to cloud and in general software defined.
Yeah, and Greg, that does bring up the question in terms of cost. It seems like if you're going to really move to the SDDC format, you may be in greater danger of vendor lock-in, and that, you know, today's heterogeneous data center is a crazy patchwork of all sorts of vendors. But if you're going to lay in an SDDC format, it seems like you're going to have to really be focused on one vendor or a couple of vendors that must be interoperable. Yay, nay on the cost issue?
You know what, a couple of points here, James, is that first, you got to remember the golden rule of software-defined anything. And the golden rule of software-defined anything is whoever controls the software-defined controls the gold. If you control the management, if you control the software-defined network, data center, storage, whatever it happens to be, whoever controls that controls the gold.
It sounds like vendor lock-in.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is a key question, which is, does software in general, but software defined, actually move or simply abstract the point of vendor lock-in? You can make arguments pro or against it, but I think it's one of those considerations. But here's something to think about. When it comes to lock-in, is vendor or technology lock-in a bad thing? Some will tell you it is, some will tell you it won't. I'd say it goes back to, look, if you're getting a benefit, if you're getting a business benefit out of whatever it happens to be, vendor lock-in, technology lock-in may not be a bad thing. But what I want to go back to is, there's a couple of interesting points made there around cost, okay? Because we hear a lot about whether it's cost or cloud or virtual or software-defined or whatever it happens to be, open source. Usually tends to be around cost because that's a hot button. Usually around CapEx, OpEx, because those are popular buzz terms in the industry. But there's this big thing around perpetual versus subscribe. Whether you're a CapEx, OpEx, it really gets back to is, are you buying it all up front, capital or operating budget, or are you paying as you go? Are you going to buy it? Are you going to lease it?
And OpEx is very fashionable these days.
OpEx is unbelievable fashionable. In fact, it's funny is the industry uses OpEx, CapEx. Some customers do, but they tend to talk a little bit different language. But Dana made an interesting point around the OpEx, and I think he's got some interesting themes and ideas there that, the rallying point for the cloud is cut cost, but you really know it's cheaper, okay? Or software defined, reduce cost, shift to OpEx, it should be savings. How do we know that? Simply saying, I'm going software defined, change my cost. Has software defined magically allowed organizations to understand what their costs are? Do all of a sudden they know what the cost of that virtual network, that virtual storage, that virtual machine, of doing a backup or doing an archive? Have they magically all of a sudden overnight figured out what their costs are? So I think, Dana, you mentioned, so they can do that apples to oranges comparison. If I dress up, put a tie on, get some of you to come in with me, I'll bet we could convince many organizations that we can do things cheaper than they could by going to whatever our model is, because I'm betting on the simple fact most organizations don't have the management tools, the insight, to understand what their costs are. And I think, Dana, that goes to your point, is that if you can get that information, if you can get that insight of what your costs are, then you can make informed decisions. But in light of that, it doesn't matter whether you're going software-defined, hardware-defined, cloud, legacy, you're flying blind.
Well, I think...
go ahead, Dan. Yeah, go ahead.
Most companies know what their total cost of IT is. They have to. In order to be a business, they've got to come out with a profit and loss statement at the end of the year and the end of the quarter. What they don't know is what portion of that cost is wasted and what portion of that cost should go into a modernization rather than a maintenance funding. So what companies want to do is understand more about what the unique costs are for different resource allocations that support their workloads, whether it's data or applications, and then have a better sense of how to shop, how to be a better buyer, to procure based on a set of requirements, rather than wait till the end of the year comes in, tally up all the bills for IT and say, oh, wow, we're spending 50% of our capital on IT rather than 20% or 10%. So it is about economics. But software-defined, automated, and management, and the services, particularly a services orientation and an IT service management model that then leads to a business service management model. We're using ITIL in order to get a handle on what your services are as a bureau, as a broker. These are all part of the same economic question. So we're not just talking about technology transformation, we're talking about the economics of IT transformation, which is an underpinning of the IT of business.
And Dan, I think that's the key.
Economics of business.
I think that's the key thing is, you know, whether software-defined, cloud, virtual, whatever is in the discussion, where the business derives the benefit out of all of this is how do they make that transition to know what their costs are, to know what their overhead are, so they can make those. But it's about a cultural transformation of how they do and deliver and use IT, how they consume it. Are they buying, renting, etc.? Are you hardware defined? Are you software defined? Are you marketing defined? Whatever it happens to be. But that's the key, Dana, is the organizations have to use these tools. The automation is good, but if you don't have the policy, the rules, the processes to implement the automation, you've just bought a new technology and probably use it in old ways.
Well, let's move on to what I think is probably the buzziest, hottest topic that there is, and that's like, containers. Seems like the last 3 to 6 months, containers have come out of nowhere, and everyone's talking about containers, and containers are going to, overtake virtualization. How does the theme of containers fit into, enhance, or detract from software-defined data center? Yoram, you would know about this. What's your sense of that?
So I think container is probably going to be a good contender for the next generation of server virtualization, and it's going to impact other parts of the data center as well. So if we look at where server-defined software-defined servers started, it's all started about solving the problem of how you can isolate different software-based entities from one another so they could each run their own physical server emulation in a way that can work on a single piece of hardware. And virtualization was the first way to do it, basically emulate everything, make sure it is running, and you could support different versions of server hardware on the same platform and get a lot of benefit. But that comes at a cost, and the cost is the overhead that a full emulation brings with it. So container basically go the next step and says, okay, let's assume that we don't need to carry a lot of legacy application, which is what all the new software as a service companies do, and we can run on a single platform. Then can we have a way to do the same virtualization or the same effect of virtualization by lowering the overhead and making sure that resource utilization is better by basically sharing the same, not just the same hardware resources, but the same basic operating system resources. So for every new company that doesn't have a lot of legacy, that's a really great way. For all the new clouds, that's a great way, a better way, a more efficient way. So I think virtualization was kind of a stepping stone in a way that it was the only way you can get into an existing traditional infrastructure and say, I can take whatever you got and transform it into a virtualized world. But once you are in a virtualized world, I think containers is probably the next step. Now, container is just, again, the server piece. And apparently everything starts on the server side. It doesn't impact on the other entity, the networking, the storage, and we are yet to see whether all those pieces can come together and give you a much more efficient utilization, better automation than virtualization. If this is true and this is possible, this could be an evolution of software-defined data center, and I think it's good news in the sense that software-defined data centers should continue to evolve rather than stay the same place and say, okay, we got to a nirvana of, say, software-defined server, and we don't need to change. I think this shows that even software-defined server, which nobody would argue is a real significant transformation, may not be the end game, and there is a much better way to do it, which is containers. So the short story, in my opinion, is it's a great opportunity. Time will tell if this will mature to be the next generation of virtualization.
Alessandro, your take? I mean, are containers going to be the next wave, and you know, is VMware going to be able to you know, deal with this challenge to its virtualization stance?
Yeah, well, I'm sure VMware will learn how to deal with it for sure. But
Yeah.
I will just quote one of our financial customers. He basically said, Alessandro, when in the history of humanity, when we wake up 100 years from now, virtualization will be forgotten. I think containers are the way to go. I think containers, virtualization struggled at every level, even the network level. Always there's a performance penalty, right? So if you can find a way to do the same things, accomplish the same results with the different tools that doesn't incur into the same penalties in terms of performance, and so you can get more bare metal-like performance, I think that probably will see a lot of adoption. I have no crystal ball. I have no idea about the future, but I think that the advantage of virtualization for the next decade, at least 5 years, whatever it's going to be, is that there are mature toolkits and orchestration tools built around virtualization, not to mention an entire ecosystem of applications built around that. So it will take generations in order to do the change. However, if there are compelling reasons to move away from virtualization to a more like a bare metal type of virtualized approach, then that will happen. I don't know, time will tell, but I view this as one dimension of software defined. It's just a tool, whether it's virtualization or container, you're trying to accomplish the same results. Now, I mean, I subscribe to what Yoram just said. I mean, it's interesting.
Let's go ahead and we'll leave containers behind. Look to the future of the software-defined data center. If we have this discussion, you know, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, what is it going to look like? Where is this going? Is it going to go there quickly, or is it going to go there slowly? Greg, what's your sense? 5 years in the future of this, where is this going?
Okay, so if we look at this in two ways, one is from the industry perspective. In other words, the vendors, the pundits, etc. They're going to be talking about something, and they might even be talking amongst themselves, hey, whatever happened to containers, software-defined, whatever the current buzz activity is, because they will be on to something new. The industry becomes bored very, very quickly. Once everybody starts adopting a common narrative, a common language, they're going to move on to something new. Containers, we're seeing that example already. Virtualized, it's become a commodity term, so we need to move on to something else. So they'll be on, the industry will be on to what is next on the timeline, the wave. On the other hand, the IT customers, okay, they're going to be going like, hey, whatever happened to all that software-defined buzz, the software-defined marketing, all these other things, while they're in the process of actually talking and rolling out and deploying and using what the industry is telling them they should be doing right now. So you're going to see the industry moving on to whatever is going to be next. You'll see the customers starting to deploy what we as an industry are telling them to do right now. They're going to actually be deploying. So that you got those different timelines.
Yoram, you agree? What's your sense? The future of software defined?
Yeah. Again, nobody knows what the future is, but I definitely agree. I think that nobody knows what forms this will take, but I have no doubt that software is gaining much more power and becoming much more dominant. And I mean, it's the way things usually are. It's always going from bottom up, which is the lower stacks always get commoditized. So it was chips in the beginning, then systems. So it's very clear that the way is that software always takes over. And now I think, and going forward 3 years or 5 years or how far you want to go forward, I think the data center would be very different and would be much more software-defined. Whatever form software-defined will take, and we all pointed to all the challenges, all the mismatches between the different parts. But at the end of the day, I think over time things will become much more integrated. I think the issue that was mentioned earlier about vendor lock-in, which is a big issue in hardware right now, and it is a big issue with software right now, software-defined, because the software vendor is becoming the new vendor that you are locked into. In my opinion, there will be ways to make components that can interoperate and therefore let the customer choose the best pieces to put together. Maybe it's going to be a long time, but the hardware guys have shown us that you can define very well defined interfaces and create components independently by different companies. We are definitely not there on the software side, but if software defined will be critical, I think it will be critical to build those interfaces to enable different companies, different entities to build different parts that they can integrate and interoperate, so the vendor lock-in issue, which we all know is going to be a roadblock, is going to be solved in one way or another.
The open API, among other things.
See, open source definitely could be one of the tools, but not necessarily just open source. It's all about defining we are not at that point yet, but if we would get to the point that we can define interfaces and draw the borders, which are very, very, nobody knows where the borders are exactly, but if there is a way to do it, then I think we can get to at least getting the point of vendor lock-in not to be a major issue.
Dana, the future of software defined, what are we going to be talking about 3 years from now, and what are you telling companies that they need to do in terms of looking into the future?
Sure. Well, we have to look at what their major requirements are. Companies want to have agile business processes, and they don't want to be waiting around for IT when they say we need to change, and they don't want to be held ransom by the costs and taxes that are employed by various vendors. So that's not going to change. They're going to continue to want to have what I call fungibility, which is to move from one type of host environment to another. They're going to want to have preset integrations and automation so that they're not playing systems integrator every time they want to update or change their infrastructure or software. And they're going to want portability, but not portability at the app level, portability at the entire workload. And they want that to be consistent across development, test, and then operations in a variety of different hosting environments, which gives them a marketplace to play in and gives them pricing power as a consumer rather than as someone that's held hostage by a vendor or a platform. So in order to do that, software-defined, containers, open source, cloud, these are all contributing factors to giving them that portability. So you can think of this as rather a very much like a power struggle between a oligarchy and a democracy. The democracy are the users and the end user organizations, and the oligarchs are those that control the technology. But what we've seen over the past 20 years is every time we think that there's a vendor that's going to run away with the entire ball game, it doesn't happen. Whether it's open source, whether it's standards, whether it's a new technology that comes along. The fact is, though, if it does go to software, it's much easier, to Yoram's point, to come around and find a way out of a lock-in at the software level than it is at a strictly hardware level. You can find different approaches. You can virtualize on top of virtualization if you need to, as long as you have the ability to make that performance requirement met. So I do think we're going to see more software defined. We're going to see it at a holistic level. We're going to see more integration, but is that integration going to happen by a vendor that runs away with the entire infrastructure stack, or is it going to happen by a service provider that says, run any stack you want, I can run it cheaper than anybody else, including you? So it's a very tumultuous time. But I think what's probably the biggest takeaway is that the power is more and more in the hands of the democracy, of the end-user organizations. They know what they want for their business requirements. They know IT is essential for them to do that. And they've got the resources to find the right solution. No Fortune or Global 2000 or S&P 500 company is going to let any one vendor dictate 50% of their capital spend. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting your analogy of the democracy versus the oligarchy, and that I I think this era that we're in, with mobile, social, is really there's an enormous amount of change there. It feels to me almost vaguely like the .com era. There's a lot of shifts going on. Cloud. Seems like the legacy vendors are really struggling to catch up, and some of the smaller companies are really moving ahead. But at any rate,
well, just to double down on that, the operators in IT organizations, whether they're in service providers or enterprises, talk to each other a lot. They have a great community effect. In fact, you could argue that social media grew out of geeks talking to geeks about what's going on with technology. That's not going to change.
right. Alessandro, looking in your crystal ball, I know you have an infallible sense of what's happening in the future. I mean, after all, you've got Leonardo da Vinci up in your office, so tell us what we're going to be talking about 3 years from now with software defined.
I think the same themes that we're trying to address today will be still popular and relevant 3 years from now, but I think 3 years from now we will have even a more mature ecosystem of software and hardware and cloud. I actually view Amazon as one of the big winners in the overall SDDC. I think Amazon is probably the largest threat to all the incumbents.
Now, why is AWS the biggest winner in software defined?
Because the software-defined is very much connected to the ability to virtualize your entire data center, and the Amazon model or the cloud model, AWS model, takes that to the extreme. You don't have to even run anything on premise, and if they keep lowering the prices the way they're doing it, they will become even more competitive with the current infrastructure. So I think actually this will put between containers, between Amazon, between the maturation of OpenStack and other technologies, I think this will put a lot of pressure on incumbents, and this is great for customers, end users.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. It's going to be interesting no matter how it turns out. I thank the four of you for your expertise. A lot of good stuff. I will. I'll send you the link to this video. It'll be on demand, and we can all tweet about it and promote it. And I thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.